Welcome to the San Diego Psychological Association's podcast, Diving into Healing. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Carcel. This podcast has been developed with the intent to inform and educate the general public and providers and should not be relied upon for any other purpose. The content, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and not those of the San Diego Psychological Association. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Mariela Shibley, a clinical and forensic psychologist specializing in issues related to immigration and trauma. On today's show, we will be discussing the emerging role of mental health professionals in the immigration field. Welcome, Dr. Shibley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So I'm curious, this is a great topic for clinicians and for the general public. I thought we could kind of jump in and tell me a little bit about how you got started in immigration evaluations.
Oh, how I got started. It was a kind of a side road. Life took me kind of on a diversion there. I really wanted to specialize in perinatal mood disorders. And I actually, got special training for that and started trying to market my services. And around that same time, my husband was an attorney. He's still my husband. He's just not an attorney anymore. And he was working at a firm where they had immigration attorneys. And so they found out that I was a therapist, and they said, well, she could help us with our clients, like evaluating them and writing reports that would help their cases. So they basically trained me. They showed me, what they needed and what needed to be included, what needed to be excluded, in the sense that it wasn't relevant. And so I started, I did one, and then I got all this feedback, and then I did another one. And so here I am, as I'm trying to really grow my practice with an expertise in perinatal mood disorders. All these evaluations keep coming. And so finally I just said, I think, this is my niche. It found me, right? And so, it just sort of really just kept growing from there.
Oh, that's fantastic. When I think of psychological evaluations, there's so many criteria, so many reasons that a person would require a psychological evaluation. I'm curious, who would specifically benefit from a psychological evaluation for immigration?
Well, so there's so many different cases for which somebody could need an evaluation. The most common type of evaluation that I do, it's actually not evaluating the foreign national, the person trying to adjust their status. It's actually their loved one. So usually a spouse or a parent.
Mm.
Sometimes, depending on the case, it could be a child.
Oh, wow.
And so what happens is, so say, two people get married. One is a U.S. citizen or resident. The other one is a foreign national without status. So meaning they're here undocumented, without permission, either because they entered without permission or they entered with permission, but they overstayed the amount of time that they were allowed to be here. So they get married and everything's legitimate, but when they try to adjust this person's status, meaning get them the green card, because they were here unlawfully for a certain amount of time, they have to serve like usually a 10-year ban outside of the United States. So a story that I always tell is, like this girl, the prototypical story is a girl who's brought here from Mexico when she's 2 years old. She grows up here. She goes to school here. She even has siblings that are born here. Then comes a time when she has to get her driver's license, and she finds out that she can't because she's undocumented. And then she also cannot attend. There's not a lot of options for her to go to school because it's so expensive because she's undocumented. She can't really work because she doesn't have a work permit. So a lot of limitations. But say she did meet someone who's a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident, they get married, and now they have to decide, do we separate for 10 years and live in two different countries? Or does the spouse move move abroad in order for them to stay together? And so sometimes, this is someone who's never left the United States since she was brought here when she was two, right? So this is really her home. This is all she knows. Sometimes, people don't
Hmm.
even speak the language
Hmm.
in their home country. And sometimes they already have kids here.
Hmm.
that are, obviously like US citizens and attending school or receiving whatever, whatever benefits that they need if they have any medical problems or whatever. This is their life. And so all of a sudden you need to uproot this family
Hmm.
because of this penalty they have to serve. So what would happen is the only reason they would waive that penalty is if in this case, the spouse, the US citizen, could prove that a separation or a relocation would result in extreme cruelty to them, not the child, not the foreign national, but
Okay.
the US citizen or resident spouse. So that's the person that comes in to see me. And, sometimes they're already separated. So then the evaluation is, a little more straightforward in that, how are you doing? And just evaluating their mental status and their stressors, etc. But sometimes they're still together. So it's really more an anticipation of how it would affect you. And so in that sense, you really need to understand their personality, how they deal with
Hmm.
separations, with loss, issues that they've been carrying on for forever, right? So that's the most common type of evaluation.
Right.
I also then do evaluations when someone is the victim of domestic violence,
Wow.
and the victim is undocumented, and so they need to substantiate their claim of abuse, and for that they help. It helps getting a psychological evaluation that says their presentation is consistent with what one would expect from someone who's been abused. So something along those lines. So those are just two types, but there's really a lot of different cases for which people benefit from an immigration evaluation, and that's the thing that the idea is that it's always evaluating the immigrant, but that's not true. It's actually we evaluate the family.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's not necessarily what comes to my mind. And I think that's probably not what comes to most people's minds when we think of a psychological evaluation for immigration. But I can see, that the relevance of that as you're discussing it. And fortunately, I a little familiar with what you do, but I'm really glad to hear the clarification of who could benefit from this. And I'm going to jump around here a little bit because as you were speaking, it made me think of, you were mentioning basically a DACA child, somebody who's grown up into this country, and doesn't know any different. And it can be really hard because they're already assimilated into westernized culture, into this culture. They are American by all intents and purposes. So it can be very traumatic, very emotional. I'm sure you deal with a lot of that. And I'm curious for you, coping as a clinician, but also helping families through this very traumatic time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and the example that I gave is, it's very simplistic, right? I mean,
Mhm.
immigration law is just so complex. It's not as straightforward. So, for example, somebody could argue, well, like she's been here since she was 2. Why doesn't she qualify for DACA, which allows her to work? So sure, there's a lot of nuances, right? But
Mhm.
reality is that not everybody qualifies for everything.
Mhm.
What's really interesting is working with people who are in a mixed status family. So that is, someone is documented and one or more other people are not. So that's a mixed status family. And
Mhm.
immigration status is almost like a taboo. And it's not just the fear, naturally, of being found out, but it's also the stigma associated with it. And so people don't really want to talk about it.
Mhm.
And for a while, we had some support groups for family members of people who were undocumented, for them to be able, because, like they go to work and they can talk about, problems with their spouse. They can talk about problems with the kids, their health, but the immigration status is not something someone really talks about. And so they keep it in, or they just deny it. Their mind just sort of chooses to push it away, and let's not think about it. That's not happening. But really, underneath, it's really lurking and really affecting everyone.
Yeah, and when I think about the impact of, just in light of the last several years, there's been a lot at the border here in San Diego. We've seen a lot of representation in news outlets, and it is heartbreaking to see how this process can be so traumatic. Specifically, separation of children from their parents, these type of things, and this isn't political. This is humanitarian, right? I refuse to bring in any political piece to this. It's more, the trauma that comes from the immigration process, the migration process, if it's a group of people. But immigrating to another country, we don't talk about that. That's actually a very big deal.
Hmm.
There's a substantial amount of emotional stress,
Hmm.
mental health stress. It's not a small thing to completely change cultures, and that a lot of people that are coming to this country in particular are leaving very dire situations where their life is in jeopardy, or something is really wrong, and it just can be very traumatic. And in this podcast, we're gearing, I think, to clinicians, but also to talk to the general public, to bring awareness, right? And for anybody who needs support and needs, help, that they know that there are psychologists like yourself that can help and really be there, and myself as well, that can support them, in different ways. So I think it's good to continue to just kind of bring this awareness.
Absolutely, and you're totally right. I mean, immigration is can be all the way to traumatic, but it's always stressful, right? Regardless of the reasons behind the immigration, the way that a person immigrates, um, it's it involves a lot of loss, right? So you're
Mhm.
leaving behind
Mhm.
a lot. Your your customs, your language, your food, your music, your friends, your family, your setting, and having to really acculturate in a completely different country, different language, perhaps not always, but and so yeah, so there's a lot of stress associated with immigration, and to that end of the spectrum, what I'm talking about, trauma, you see, refugees who are fleeing their country, who don't really want to leave their country. They don't really want to come to the United States. It's they have to. It's in order to survive.
Mhm.
That's very different from a person who's like, oh, I've always dreamt of, living the American dream, and I saved up all my money and I'm going to move there. It's a very different experience,
Mhm. Yes, exactly.
but both are stressful to different degrees.
Yes, and I'm glad that we're just bringing that up, just the generalized stress, and that there are levels of trauma here. For some, it's
Hmm.
not as
Hmm.
stressful, maybe not as traumatic, but that it's still, like you said, I like the idea of just using that word stress. It is still stressful. You're still coming to a whole new place, and even for people of this country going to another place. I mean, anybody can, I think, relate to this
Hmm.
to some degree. But I think when we talk about immigration, I don't know. For me, it automatically feels like it's a debate.
Hmm.
And that is not necessarily the case, right? We're here to help. You're doing these evaluations to help people, um, to get them through a very stressful time. And, that's a big part of the evaluation process, I imagine.
Yeah, and while it doesn't always help, unfortunately, sometimes there's not a lot that would really benefit their case. But that's, I think attorneys know whom to refer and whom not to. So, the large majority of people that come to my office are people who really do benefit from these reports. But just the process of the evaluation, even though it's not therapy, it's like I said before, these are things that they don't really talk about. So being able to talk about it, to talk about all their fears, their shame, um, that's really powerful just to at least get it out, right? So a lot of people at the end of the evaluation, they thank me, and I'm thinking like, well, I didn't really I didn't really do much, right? I just asked you a lot of questions, but no, I listened, and with openness and curiosity, which I think that's that goes a really long way.
Yes, it does, and thank you for that. That's wonderful. When you're mentioning the evaluation process, I think it'd be good to understand what the process actually entails for anyone listening who might need this service. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's more of a, I guess you would call it like a therapeutic evaluation in the sense that it's not this forensic, rigid evaluation where you basically need to demonstrate something that you're claiming, right? That you were injured. This is more, first of all, most cases, there's really not a lot of testing involved. I like using personality testing, but that's just because of I base a lot of what I say on the person's, you know, character and personality, not so much on symptoms.
Hmm.
Yeah, so usually they will come and they'll do some testing, usually self-report measures that are pretty straightforward, and then we do the interview, and that's face to face, and for as long as it takes, usually an hour and a half, 2 hours, depends. um, and then is when I do the personality testing that they also do on their own, and then that's it. Some people have them come more than one time. um, I would love that, but experience has taught me that it's not very convenient. um, Immigration, if you think, if a person who's needing an immigration evaluation is either here either unlawfully, or I don't like to say unlawfully. They're here without permission, right? Without papers, and um,
Hmm.
and their opportunities for work are very limited. Or
Right.
if they're a mixed status family, because their opportunities for work are limited, only one person works. So at any rate, immigration filing fees are super high. Immigration attorneys fees are super high, and so they don't have a lot of funds to spare, because a lot of times they have to take the day off work, or they might have to travel a long way to come see me, or they might need to pay for daycare in order to be here. And so it's for those reasons that I try to make it as simple as possible, and just come one time for a bunch of hours, and that'll be all. So then I just write the report on my own, and then I send it. Usually they sign a release, so I can send it directly to the attorney. That way they don't have to deal with paperwork, or losing it or anything, and it's goes straight to the attorney.
Great.
So that's the process for most of them.
Yes, it is. And I'm glad that you simplify it and that you take that consideration for them because you're right. A lot of these people, the resources aren't just, it's not abundant. They're not, most people aren't coming here with resources to that level. So to make it convenient is so important. So that's wonderful that you do that. And yes, I'm familiar with your book. I think this is a great publication to help out specifically clinical psychologists or forensic psychologists who are looking to get into this field. And I imagine that there's not a lot of people. I personally only know you that specialize in this. It's a very specific niche. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so it's becoming more and more, it's getting more out there. So, but it is true in comparison. Um, the, the immigration evaluations are not as popular, I guess, as other
Hmm.
types of evaluations. And there are maybe a couple books out there that cover this type of evaluations. And but the thing is, like you said to help psychologists and forensic psychologists, and the whole purpose of my book is catered towards all mental health professionals, because
Hmm.
this is a field where, as long as you are a mental health professional who's licensed and able, and has the adequate education, training, and experience to do this type of work, anyone can do it.
Hmm. Great.
And sometimes the titles of the other books, can be off-putting,
Hmm.
and even misleading, and make like a person with an LCSW or an LPCC think like, oh, I can't do that. That's only for psychologists, and it's not.
Hmm.
So I made it very accessible to all types of mental health professionals, and it's very much like a guide that I even to talk about like how to add this to your practice, how to streamline the process of all the administrative stuff, for example, or how to market your services, etc. It's something that, unlike some other types of evaluations that can only be done by doctorate level
Hmm.
therapists, these can be done by pretty much
Oh,
anyone
that's
who's
great.
a mental health provider.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I'm glad that you brought that up. So that's actually even better to know that for any, licensed mental health provider that they are able to incorporate this into their own. We're used to psychologists being kind of the primary testing group within the mental health field. But of course, if anyone else is qualified or feels that they want to add this onto their practice, that's wonderful that they can.
Hmm.
I love that. I think it's very needed right now. I think it's been needed.
Yeah, and so I even so I started during COVID, where we had a period there where we didn't know what to do, right? Until we figured out how to do it via telehealth, and
Hmm.
and that was okay. That was doable, but not my preference. I finally was able to devote some energy into starting a training program. So I also train mental health professionals on how to do these evaluations.
Great. Yeah. And we'll put this information as part of our link for the podcast so people can take a look and have the references, because especially for clinicians that are looking to get this kind of training, or if they're, wanting to get more information, I think this is a significant place and field to be in.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I sometimes I'd be giving a talk, at a conference or something with mental health professionals, and it's like for most people, their idea of helping it is number one, they need to speak another language,
Hmm.
they think, or their idea of it is like, I don't know, having to go down to the border, and their image of the immigrant is an asylum seeker.
Mm.
So it's so much more um, nuanced than that, right?
Hmm.
And the other way that also mental health professionals can work is not just by doing these evaluations. They can offer their services, they can market their services to these communities who, again, are oftentimes
Hmm.
struggling financially. So they tend to be underserved. And also, they can write letters if one of their patients is going through an immigration process. A letter from a treating therapist can go a really, really long way. So it wouldn't be, the report that I do, but it's writing a letter on behalf of your patient, which I think a lot of mental health professionals get freaked out at the thought of having to put anything in writing about their patient. It's like, okay, relax. It's okay, right? So I like to help mental health professionals,
Right.
through that as well, and do some reality checking and like, no, this is really important, and it can be really helpful, and does not require a lot from you, and is not a liability. This is not a litigious field.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
like personal injury, right?
Right.
Where I didn't get what I wanted, so I'm mad at you, and
Yeah.
I'm gonna,
It's different.
file a complaint with your board.
Yes, of course. Unfortunately, there are these concerns, liability and things like that. But, the benefit, number one, I personally just feel this way, but we're in this field to help our clients, help our patients. And at the end of the day, doing that within the parameters, of course, to cover ourselves, yes, but to make sure that we're doing the best we can, kind of taking a little bit of the medical Hippocratic oath, but doing it in a clinical way,
Yes,
do no harm, and to
yes,
help in every way that we can. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because yes, in our field there tends to be a, "Ooh, can we do that?" And we tend to tiptoe, but yes, we can, and we can help out. And I think what you're talking about, and your training and what you're doing is really very important, in that we just don't talk about this a lot in our field. So I can't imagine for the general population how they even know, like, how to get this kind of help.
right.
So this is important for people to hear it too.
Right, right, because they think, either, well, if I want to go into forensic work, they go into it, right? They get the adequate training and all that stuff. But this is something that it doesn't have to be obviously like all you do. This is by all means like not all I do. So it's a really nice addition that, like when I started, I was doing like one per month.
Hmm.
People can do that as well, right? Just saying, this is something that I kind of do on the side just to be helpful, because I know it's very helpful to keep these families together mainly, right? Or to give people a good quality of life,
Hmm.
feeling safe in this country when they're willing to be contributors to society.
Hmm. That's
So,
absolutely right. I agree. And I wanted to, we were touching on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask you directly, because being in forensics work, and both clinical and forensic mental health they're both trying. They're both, stressful. talking to clinicians who are listening that, we need to make sure we self-care. I was listening to somebody talk about aftercare, and I agree with this, the difference between self-care and aftercare being that we end up taking care of ourselves after all of this vicarious trauma, after going through all this stuff versus
Mhm,
preparing for it,
mhm.
taking our breaks. You see a lot of this, you deal with a lot of this. How do you approach this yourself? How do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Aftercare makes me sad, actually, to hear you
Yeah.
say it, because it is a truth. But what I always say is like prevention is always easier and cheaper than repair,
Mhm.
and it's something that we need to be mindful of as we go along. And so, having that balance, and I'm not just talking about work life balance, but balance in between, like what drains us and what fills us,
Mhm.
right? And if we keep prioritizing things that either drain us or don't fulfill anything for us, basically, then that cup starts to get emptier and emptier,
Right.
and until a point of burnout, and then we're no good for anybody or ourselves. One thing. I mean, of course, there's so many things that you could incorporate to really take care of yourself and protect yourself. For me, one thing that's really helpful is having colleagues that I can talk to, because it's not the same oftentimes, talking to a friend about a difficult case, about a difficult situation. In trying to empathize with you, they'll interrupt you and start talking about something similar that happened to them. And you're like, I still got a lot of words in my mouth that I want to get out, right? Whereas as therapists, we know how to listen, and we know about confidentiality. We know that, okay, it's okay if you can't tell me, but these details, and I respect those limits, but you can still, share your feelings. And so I think really leaning on colleagues for me has been, life saving. In addition to, of course, having
Mhm.
time for family and those things that again like recharge us. It's the feeling good activities that increase the feeling good part, and slowly start to fill up your cup.
Yes, knowing our own coping mechanisms, knowing our own things that help us on a day-to-day and making sure that we set that balance and yes, I agree the aftercare is sad. It's not ideal. And I think a lot of people are feeling so much over the last several years, especially with COVID, and there's just been so many things even recently. It's been tough. And I think it's important for us to take care of ourselves no matter who it is, whether you're a clinician or just someone listening curious about this topic, that we all take care of ourselves. And I also wanted to bring up something in along these lines, but talking about culture. When we talk about immigration, culture and context matter. There are so many people from different cultures that we're trying to blend in, trying to either assimilate, acculturate. There's a lot of conflict, a lot of belief systems, attitudes, things that we have to be open minded to. And I think we sometimes get our sources of information, and that can be just limiting because we're only hearing from a certain source or a certain area. But the reality is that all of us can be affected to some degree by any of the factors that affect people who are immigrating, which is poverty. There may be, socioeconomic concerns, financial. There can be the refugee situation. These are more extremes. We're very privileged in this country, so that we're not seeing a lot of these, but we're also
Hmm.
we don't want to limit ourselves and just by one resource. We want to learn, I think. And for anybody listening that's curious about this, there's great information online. Like the American Psychological Association actually has a whole listing of information that talks about what is acculturation, what is assimilation, right? What is marginalization? These are terms that I'm using right now that sound really big, but basically what these things mean is how a person adapts to their new culture, if they're struggling to adapt to their new culture, and how we as citizens, and even though I consider myself bicultural, I was born here, so I do feel that privilege, but I also was raised in my country of origin. So having these privileges, having this understanding can really help. So I think as a clinician or as somebody who's just learning about, somebody else who's coming into this country, that we can learn how to be open-minded.
Yeah, and I think what I've found, you know, again, being an immigrant myself, and culture is a big part. Like it's a lens that I never take off when I'm
Hmm.
working with someone, and I found that it really helps understand families and relationships, because a lot of times saying I'm from another place, right, another country, the only thing that's really absorbed is just that you came from a different culture, perhaps,
Hmm.
right, different language, and that's the extent of. But there's so much tied to it, and there's so many cultural values, even in multi-generational families, in the sense that where perhaps the parents immigrated here, so they're first generation, and then they have children who are born here, right, like yourself, right,
Yep, like
so
me.
it's
Yep.
second generation.
Yep.
And at first the parents in the home, you instill all those cultural values that
Hmm.
that the parents brought with them, and then as the child starts getting older, starts going outside and incorporates all these other cultural customs and values, and that
Hmm.
some of them might actually be inconsistent and compatible with those of their family. And so there's these clashes, there's this misunderstandings, these feelings of alienation and reactions that can be very hurtful to people who are really all they're doing is trying to connect, but they're just going about it like really wrong way, unknowingly, of course. And so even in individual therapy, working with my patients who are second generation, helping them kind of understand where their parents might be coming from,
Right.
right, the experience that they had were very different than yours.
Absolutely.
And right,
Hmm.
and so these expectations that some people have of being same,
Hmm.
reality is they have a totally different background and experiences, and which is no worse or better, it's just different. And so being able to really see things from another person's perspective can be really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about this in that broader context, that's a good message for all of us, just to listen to each other's stories, try to understand as much as we can and be curious about people. And, immigrants, people of diverse backgrounds, they experience things that maybe another person doesn't. We don't have all the shared same experiences, so we have to learn how to listen to each other and learn from each other. And I think particularly, especially as of late in the recent years, I think the immigration story, it has been lost. This whole process has been lost a little bit, so it's good that we're bringing it up and letting clinicians know that, hey, we can do more, yes, research on this. We can do more. There is actually a lot of good research, but continuing that research, and do a lot more training. And also, one last thing I wanted to say here, and I definitely want to give us some more time for anything that you think would be significant to this, but considering the fact that there are limited clinicians here in San Diego and this area, are there any broader trainings that you would recommend for people outside of Southern California, or should we refer to any clinicians who might be listening in another state where they can get this kind of training?
Well, my trainings are all online.
Oh, okay.
So they're live, but they're online. So most of the people that do my trainings are actually from all over the United States, right? From
Oh, that's
the East
great.
Coast and Texas and California. So that's of course accessible. I know of a couple other people who also do trainings. I think most of them are just pre-recorded,
Okay.
right? So you just purchase it and watch it in your own time. I have those as well, but I'm Latina. I like to interact with people, right? So I'm always like trying to push for the live one, and plus you get to answer all these questions, and it's just so much more personable, right?
Great.
So yes, so there are trainings out there, and books like my book. I think it's the most like kind of hands-on training. It's like I call it like a practical guide, so it gives you examples and stuff like that. And there are other books as well,
Mhm.
that talk about it. Now, these are mainly for evaluations.
Right.
Same with the trainings; they're mainly for evaluations.
Right.
But I'd be happy to consult with someone if it comes to, working with a mixed status family, trying to understand the family dynamics, relationship. That's something that we can all benefit from getting better at, right?
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shibley, for being here. This has been a wonderful talk. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I don't know. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head.
No worries. I loved our conversation. I think that for a lot of clinicians out there that want to get this additional experience, we have a wonderful resource like yourself, and I'm glad to hear that. I didn't realize that you were doing it online and for people across the country and maybe even internationally, which is great. Gives a wonderful broad perspective and opportunity for people and for anybody who's listening who needs some support and is confused about the whole immigration status. If you're in a mixed family, if you're in a situation where you need that support, we're happy to help in any way that we can. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and of course, always keeping in mind that we don't want to provide legal advice,
Exactly.
without a law license. So an immigration law is just so complex. So I do get a lot of calls from clinicians saying like, I have a patient who's this and that. What should he do? And I'm like, well, he should probably call an immigration
Exactly.
attorney,
Yeah.
right? Because what I say, it's
Yes.
no. But yeah, and also, like I said before, is not just to do these evaluations. You can still help these families in a lot of other ways. You can help yourself understand your patients better. Things that perhaps you hadn't thought of, like you're working with a second generation individual and you didn't think to ask about a family of origin and where they came from and what their customs were and how they differ from them, or if they have specific, like negative feelings towards their parents when they were never around and all they did, and you understand that experience, and you can explain how well they were doing their best. Perhaps it sounds like, right?
Yeah.
But this is how they showed love. Can be like really eye opening to really understand that, like, oh, I looked at everything almost the same shade, and it's just it's so multifaceted.
Yes, definitely. And coming from a clinical perspective, that's where I think we can really do a good job at assisting people processing all of this stuff. So I'm glad you made that point that this is not legal advice. We are clinicians. And what we do is strictly clinical and forensic. And what I mean by that is it's evaluations and support. So that's basically the role that we're discussing here today. But I'm glad you mentioned that, to refer to an immigration attorney, because that is where a lot of people will probably need more assistance. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. But thank you so much, Dr. Shibley. This was a great talk. Really happy to have you on. And we will put the resources at the end of the podcast for people to look at. Yes, I look forward to speaking with you hopefully in the near future again.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to speak to you.
The information and advice offered is not intended to treat or diagnose and is not meant to replace any other professional consultation. If you'd like to know more about the San Diego Psychological Association, go to our website at sdpsych.org. That's sdpsych.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care of yourself and be well.